presentation. Let me begin with a little bit of background about the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative where I work, and a little bit about myself. So I've worked, my first foray into the humanitarian field was with an internship that I did for the security coordinator of the United Nations Children's Fund, popularly known as UNICEF. I did that back in the 90s, and I had always had an interest in humanitarian issues. And the moment I sort of stepped in the doors of UNICEF and met the person that I was going to work with for the summer, I was completely hooked. But it was what was really interesting for me was to think about some of the research related questions that came up about operational issues, about information that we needed to be able to get from various field locations, and to be able to analyze some of that information to be able to inform programming. That for me was really fascinating and led me on an academic trajectory. So my background is in research, but I've always been sort of connected to humanitarian organizations throughout the entirety of my research career. I work in three areas and focus on three different sets of things. What I'm going to talk about here today is part of work I do on disaster preparedness and resilience. So this is on the ground research that I'll show you in just a bit how we do it. Looking at what people actually do to think about and prepare for disasters. How do they experience disasters and emergencies? And what does that experience mean for the next steps that they take to prepare for disasters? Who do they expect, who do people feel have a responsibility to prepare for or respond to a disaster? And what are their actual experiences? So this is part of a larger program focused on resilience and mostly in Southeast Asia. So my work is predominantly based in the Philippines, although I've done some work in Bangladesh as well, and will be doing some work in the coming couple of years in Nepal. Second area that I work on is on humanitarian leadership. Now, this is a training course that has been funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development that's been focused on providing leadership courses for people working for national non-governmental organizations. So these are people globally working within their countries on emergencies, working for humanitarian agencies that are locally based, and providing relief in emergencies. So we provide a leadership and combined with management training for those staff. The third area that I work in is on civil military coordination. So, and again, on research, right? So I look at civil military coordination, how international militaries, various international militaries might be engaged in relief, particularly in natural, as a result of disasters from natural hazards, and what some of the challenges and opportunities are for coordination with local government and other national and international humanitarian actors on the ground. So those are the three sort of principal areas of background for myself. And like I said, I work here at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. We are at an interfaculty initiative within Harvard University, and all of our programming, both educational and research programs, are focused on the humanitarian world. And we're deeply engaged in sort of operational research with a number of different humanitarian agencies, both international and national globally. So that's a bit of background on myself and HHI. Any of you is welcome to reach out anytime if you'd like to discuss your own sort of career path and career development. If you're interested in the humanitarian sector, I'm happy to share my experiences with you. So let's turn. I hope all of you can see my screen. Good. We'll turn now to, I'm going to give you some, a look, a kind of foray into what disaster preparedness and resilience looks like in the Philippines. And this is going to be based on research that I've been doing there since 2015. So first, let's take a look at the Philippines. It's based in Southeast Asia in what is known as the Pacific Rim of Fire. It's an archipelago state. It's comprised of over 7,000 islands, more than 2,000 of which are inhabited. It's broken down into several different political divisions, regions, and provinces, with barangays being the smallest political unit, so the equivalent of like a town within the United States, and has a population of 109 million people. Now, the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to natural hazards in the world. They sit within what I just called the Pacific Rim of Fire, so they're along a number of different fault lines. They have active volcanoes, frequent earthquakes, landslides, but more often than not, they're affected by typhoons. So there's a lot of activity each year. Anywhere between 20 and 25 typhoons enter into the Philippines area of responsibility, with anywhere between 4 and 5 usually having a major impact on the country, meaning they hit land, they hit populated areas, and do some level of damage. And some of these storms can be quite significant. So the Philippines is a place that is quite accustomed to disasters, as they experience them frequently. But one in particular, Typhoon Haiyan, also locally named as Yolanda, in 2013 really shifted sort of the mindset about how to think about preparation for typhoons and weather-related events that are climate-related. So this was a typhoon, a magnitude of which Filipinos were not really accustomed to seeing, and their sort of normal preparation was inadequate for a typhoon of this magnitude. And so a lot of the messaging that went out from the government about storm surge wasn't really fully understood at the ground level by all inhabitants as being as significant a factor as the storm really was. So you had enormous storm surges that took out entire sections of cities, a city called Tacloban in particular, and caused massive damage across the country. A total of more than 1 million homes were damaged. 4 million people were displaced by this typhoon, and at least 6,109, which is the official count, died, and likely it's more than that. And a total of 14 million people were affected. And the Philippines' experience with this particular disaster was one that was a kind of wake-up call. So you would hear people using the term new normal. This is like a completely different and unprecedented thing we hadn't seen before, and this is what we have to anticipate is going to continue to happen with the impacts of climate change. And so there was this desire to really develop the level of preparedness that the state was able to bring to bear to cope with storms of this magnitude. So I initially went to the Philippines right after that storm, basically to look at how civil-military coordination was working, but it led to a research interest in what would people can actually do to prepare for these kinds of future disasters. So I'll say a little bit about how we actually do or conduct our work. So I wanted to be able to bring research and evidence to bear in and to be able to provide data and information to people making decisions about disaster management policy and about actual programming and operations on the ground. And a lot has changed since Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. The work that we're doing in the Philippines is based on a number of different levels. So the core of what we do is household level surveys. So these are representative surveys that we do. We undertake these surveys throughout the country to gather information about people's actual activities, their thoughts, their experience with disasters, and how they've coped with them in the past, how they're coping with them presently, and what their plans are for the future. So that is sort of the heart of our research and work. It's based on population-based data. We also do some work at individual community levels, where we will go to a community and ask people, what are the challenges that you're facing? And we think about ways in which we could collect evidence or do some research to evaluate the effectiveness of what they're doing, or think about new things that they might consider doing to protect and enable their communities to deal with and cope with the effects of disasters. The third area that we sort of work on and look at is looking at the network of organizations that are responsible for preparing for disasters and responding for disasters, and identifying what does that network look like? How does it work? Who's connected to whom? What kinds of information are being shared? How strong are those relationships? Where are there gaps? And so we apply what is called a network analysis, looking at, again, data from not households at this level, but organizations. And these organizations might be community-based organizations. They could be national non-governmental organizations. They could be international non-governmental organizations, local government. And we look to see how they're connected, who they get their information from, who they give information to, what the nature of the relationship is amongst those organizations, so that we can get a sense of what the network of actors looks like and be able to provide that information back to those actors so that they can see where there are gaps and where there are strengths or duplication of effort. And then third, we try to make this information that we're collecting at various levels broadly available. So sometimes it's targeted to inform specific policy or programming, and oftentimes it's going more broadly to the public. And it's doing that in several forms. It might be in academic publications. It could be in the form of symposia or workshops to discuss our research findings and what their implications are for various actors. It could be in news media and stories. So all of these are sort of different outlets for the results of the research that we're doing. So I'm going to take you through just a little bit of what we did at the household level. So that's what I'm going to reflect on here. So back in 2017, we did data collection across the country. We did a total of 5,184 surveys at the household level. And to give you an idea of what this meant and sort of what level of work goes into something like this, we spent a year and a half developing what is called the survey instrument or the questionnaire. So what we did was to begin with a scoping study on the ground to identify all of the relevant actors engaged in disaster preparedness response. And we identified experts in each of these areas, from military, from government, from community-based organizations, from the private sector, and we brought them together into group conversation. This was like a workshop. And we asked them a series of structured questions and then engaged them in conversation to ask them what are the kinds of things you need to know when you're preparing for a disaster or responding to a disaster. From whom do you need to know this information? What are the services that you provide? What are the services that are missing? What's needed? What are the gaps? And then we asked them to sort of reverse their thinking, their position, and ask them to think about being the recipient of whatever activity they might be involved in professionally, and imagine it from the position of the person receiving that aid. And then we begin again with a cycle of those questions. We bring all of that together and begin to categorize the different sets of questions. And each of these categories are different dimensions of disaster preparedness or even resilience. And then we compare that with other instruments that have been validated by doing research like this in other places in the world. So we try to look at what is unique to the Philippines and what is common across disasters, and bring this together into a single instrument, a single questionnaire. That questionnaire is then tested in order for us to be able to validate it, right? It has to be translated into different languages. So it was in 6 different Filipino languages, the main ones. And then retranslated back into English to make sure there were not errors. And then we went out and tested it with a small group of people to see how actual people in the community would respond to this. And then we modified the questionnaire based on those responses. If anything was unclear or people didn't understand what we meant, we modified those questions to make sure that what we were asking was clear. That's a year and a half worth of work. Then we train enumerators. These are the data collectors that utilize that instrument on a tablet and then go according to our sample, the way we created our sample. And they go from door to door, following a certain pattern based on the sample, and ask these questions, always the same questions for each of the families. And these are some of the results of that data. So it was a huge survey. There were over 300 questions. So altogether, we had over 1 million data points in all. But I'm just going to give you a little bit of feedback here from some of what we asked. So we asked people, again, we're asking households, right? These are people, these are adults, not anyone under 18, representing their household. We asked them what the most vulnerable structures in their community were. And not surprisingly, most people said that their homes were greatly vulnerable, but that storms, other natural hazards were also affecting farmland, so their livelihoods, transportation routes, roads, fishing sources, schools. And in the Philippines, schools are important both for educational purposes, obviously, but they also, in many smaller communities, double as evacuation centers for the community. So they're often built on higher ground. They're often a more solid structure that's invested in, and they're often double as evacuation centers in many communities, which has important implications for safety, security, and education, right? Because if you don't want to be in an evacuation center for too long, otherwise you're not having children attend school. We asked people who what they felt, who they felt was actually responsible to respond to a disaster once it happened. And overwhelmingly, people said that it was their LGU, their local government unit. So they felt that local government had a duty to be able to respond to disaster. National government also had a duty to respond, and they felt that their own families also had a duty to respond. Interestingly, most people didn't feel that it was the responsibility of INGOs to provide disaster services for whatever reason. We then asked who they felt was responsible for preparing for disaster, and it's quite similar. All right, this is a similar pattern. The same organizations and institutions that people expect to respond to disaster, they also expect to prepare for disaster. But then we asked, so when a disaster happens, where do you actually receive aid from? And here, everything is flipped. Here, it's actually their families that are providing immediate response, with some strong response from national government and local government, but a lot more coming in as well from international non-governmental organizations and local national non-governmental organizations. So whereas the vast majority of people expect local government and national government to be prepared and respond, their actual experience is that it's their own families and other civil society-based organizations and international organizations that are providing a lot of the relief and doing a lot of the work for preparedness. So basically, there's a mismatch between people's expectations of whose responsibility it is to prepare and respond and what their actual experience is, which is really important for policymakers to sort of understand and know. The other element to consider here, and this is not surprising, there's deep variation, and this is probably true of most countries, between different regions of the Philippines. So we looked at preparedness at 3 levels. So we broke it into 3 distinct areas. One was training. Did people engage in disaster response training? 2 was planning. Did they discuss with their families plans? Did they come up with, did they look for insurance? Did they do anything to communicate or think about what they would do as a family if a disaster were to happen? And the 3rd was around material investments. Were they doing things like investing in their home, preparing go bags, storing all of their important vital documents electronically instead of in paper form, those sorts of things. And you could see that at the national level, it's fairly low how involved people are in terms of training and planning. Far more is going into material investments, which is one interesting piece of data. But really interestingly here is you have such a wide variation between where people are actually able to prepare. So looking at the top thing on training, the top bar, in the National Capital Region, NCR, this is the capital of where Manila, the capital city, is located, 41% are engaged in some form of training in the National Capital Region of those we surveyed. Only 3% of people in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao are similarly involved in training. It shows you a wide disparity, wide range of access to resources, which has important implications both for preparedness and ability of people to be able to recover after disasters. There were similar wide discrepancies around planning and material investment. And the difficulty, there's almost a double burden in a place like the BARM, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, because at the same time they have very low levels of investment in preparedness, they also have sort of the dual burden of dealing with conflict at the same time that they're exposed to natural hazards, creating a significant challenge for people living in those areas. So overall, we looked at what are sort of the factors that really contribute to people's resilience based on the research that we did. One is that people have actual access to quality services and resources, that they have actual access to good information. And incidentally, most people are getting information from the internet on their smartphone from Facebook. The vast majority of people are getting information that way when it comes to the internet. And a significant portion of the population still gets information through television as well. The second piece is that people can rely on effective social support. What we found was there was a strong correlation between people's engagement in and participation in organizations or networks and their preparedness for disaster. The third is that people are actually taking steps. They're engaging in training. They're investing in their homes. They're doing planning before a disaster happens, but then learning from that process and thinking about it. There's a really strong, and for this last point, people are empowered and believe in their ability to cope and adapt. This is enormously important. We found a very strong association between a person's sense of agency and control of what they do and their actual steps that they take to prepare for future disasters, which is interesting to look at. Finally, and I realize I'm taking up a little bit more time than I thought I might, so I'll try to be brief with these last two slides. Looking at the impacts of climate change, what can we start to do as in the humanitarian field to begin to deal with some of the implications of climate change? So we know that we have a good idea that climate change is going to lead to increased food insecurity, both by direct damage to crops by extreme weather events, but also decreased nutritional output as climate changes and temperatures rise. A lot more droughts and a lot more flooding. All of that is going to put a lot of pressure on availability of highly nutritional and plentiful food. We can anticipate that with sea level rise, there's going to be a certain increase in forced displacement. In some places, there will be adaptation measures, things that people can do to adapt to the new circumstances, but in other circumstances, that's just not going to be feasible, either because the threat is too great or the resources are inadequate to meet or address that threat. And that invariably is going to lead to people having to move and leave. The third is around disease. Both vector-borne and waterborne diseases are likely to increase, directly impacting, of course, national health systems. At the same time all of this is happening, we're seeing significant changes in weather patterns, more extreme weather events that are creating an increased burden on people, so increasing humanitarian need. And although resources in the humanitarian sector are certainly increasing, they're not able to keep pace with the level of need that we're beginning to see as a result of particularly climate change impacts. And this is going to be with us to stay for our lifetimes. So this is just the reality that we're facing, and are going to have to find new ways of coping and thinking about how we understand disasters and how we prepare for them as a whole international community. So key takeaways here are that research matters, the evidence base matters, and making sure that it's applied in a way that is actionable is what is critical for us. A second piece is that, and I didn't really talk about this, that we need much more precise forecasting models so that we're put in the position as a humanitarian community to think about what we can do in advance of a disaster. And so there's a lot of discussion now around something called anticipatory action, using financing that's released in a variety of different ways to people that are about to be affected by some kind of climactic event that triggers, there's a sort of trigger that allows a pre-planned release of resources to people so that they can do whatever is needed ahead of actually being affected by a storm. And that usually goes with some sort of programming as well, so that people are already well familiar with some of the actions that they can take. The third sort of key takeaway here is to really begin with communities in any kind of work that's being done. So in any of the research that we do, we go first to the communities to figure out how to design that research so that it makes sense in the context in which we would be doing any kind of data collection. So not trying to pull out an existing model that was developed somewhere else and applying it everywhere. And then finally, there's no question that a lot more of what's happening is going to have to be in the humanitarian world is going to be have to be focused on adaptation measures as we try to cope with many of the challenges that climate change is going to present to the humanitarian community broadly. So I'll stop with that. I'm sure there's a lot of potential questions you might have about this, but happy to engage later in any kind of conversation when we get to the Q&A. And I'll pause there and hand it over to my colleague, Everett. Share.